Designing with CSS is fun. In this chapter we will learn more about CSS basics, page layouts, using background images, and style sheets. There are some really exciting enhancements in this version, and I can't wait to show them to you. Now we're going to be designing with CSS. We'll take a look at how, with the help of the CSS panel and your property inspector and a few other little tips and tricks, you'll be making great CSS in no time. We need to understand what selectors are, what the box model is, using background images. Then we can lay out our pages with CSS and then work with some style sheets. So let's get started. In my Files panel, we're going to define a site for Chapter 6. So I'm going to manage my sites. I'm going to click on New. This is going to be Chapter 6. And I will navigate to that particular chapter. Remember, we have chapters right now, but in the end, when it's your own site, you're going to be defining your root folder, and all of your files are going to be inside of your root folder. Why we're doing that, again, is so that when we move things around, then Dreamweaver helps us update our links for us. So I'm going to open my project files. I'm going to go to Chapter 6 and open, and select, and now save. I can click on Done, and if you would open CSSexplained.html, so the benefits of using CSS is pretty numerous. CSS dramatically decreases our load time, and it requires less code in page styling than when we had tables that we used to style all the time. And it makes use of system caching as well. We'll explain that in a minute. CSS enables us to display our content before our images and not the other way around. If you're brand new to Dreamweaver and you've never watched a page load before that had a lot of images on it, really nothing else on the page can happen until those images are loaded. So the fact that our content can load before our images means that even if we have really large images that are going to be loaded into our page, at least the end user can start reading our page first. CSS increases accessibility, and we'll get more into exactly what that means in a little bit as well. There's different CSS for multiple devices. So for instance, if I have a PDA, or if I have an iPhone, or now an iPad, how I want that to display in those different devices means I really just need a different style sheet. That way I don't have to totally restructure my page. I can just restructure my CSS and add things and take away things and change sizes strictly to make use of those multiple devices. CSS can also increase my SEO, or my search engine friendliness, and again we'll explain what that is in just a minute as well. So why does my page load faster? When we used tables to lay out the structure of our page, tables are not accessible really at all. They appear on our screen in all one go. So no part of the table will appear until the entire table is downloaded and rendered. So that takes a whole lot longer to display than typical rendering of CSS pages. CSS pages are typically external files. So they are called once and cached. So the entire time the user is visiting the entire site, not just the page, but the entire site, then there's no need to reload that file. Unlike a regular web page that has tables on it, so each time the user would go to a new page, it would have to reload all the tables on that page. So I'm going to scroll down just a little bit here, and we'll talk about accessibility. Accessibility is really twofold. First, we need to think about the software and the machines. So there's just greater visibility in web searches. If we are using an accessible site, meaning that we have added alt text to our images, we've utilized our column headers, captions, page titles, link titles, etc. And we've taken into consideration who is going to be using our site. Might there be somebody who needs a braille or a voice device, etc., that is going to be looking at our page? Whenever we put an image on our page, we need to think about what goes best with that particular description. And we talked a little bit about that when we inserted images. But now that we're talking about CSS, we'll also include that thought for column headers and captions and page titles etc. I've included a link on this page about the W3C, which is also the World Wide Web Consortium, and why it's important and how to meet their particular guidelines. There's really 3 sets of guidelines, and it's super important to at least meet their very first guideline. And they want to help you meet those guidelines, so they give you lots of great information. So we need to make sure that the structure on our page is correct for those types of people. Somebody who might not actually see our page at all and uses a machine to read our page for us. Keep those things in mind, our end user, while we're designing those pages. Now, search engine optimization. So spiders can typically search CSS-driven sites much easier just because of the structure of the page than typical old-style table-based pages. Oh, and by the way, a spider is also known as a robot or a crawler, and it's basically looking at and grabbing the content of your pages to add to the search engine index. So remember that it's important that you have links coming in and going out from your page, and that's what the spider is looking for, is more food to chew on. So the more times they find links to your site, the more times they will stop and visit. So Google relies especially on its spiders to create its vast index. So it's very important that we have both our content be relevant and our links be relevant on our pages. Now, as we go along through the rest of our chapters, hopefully we'll talk about usability quite a bit, especially with CSS. And some of that is that users basically spend 80% of their time above the fold. So without having to scroll on the page at all is basically what I'm talking about. I know it's a website, but think about whether you have to scroll or not, and whether you'll actually do that or not. So are you making the best experience for that particular end user? So we'll talk some about early team planning, storyboarding pages with a good explanation of why elements are where they are, use of white space, consistent elements like search forms. Basically, think about your search. Where do you expect that search to be? Do you expect it to be in the lower left-hand side of your page? No. You expect it to be in the upper right-hand corner of your page. Using low-profile prototypes. We've talked about this some already. Fireworks, InDesign, Balsamiq, etc. And really the ability with CSS to be able to reuse elements. We need to think about what things that we might want to reuse as we go through and mark up our page. And before we can really do that, we need to take a look at the box model. So we'll take a look at that next. So now let's go ahead and open up the boxmodel.html. So what the heck is a box model, and why should you even care, right? The box model is really very important, an essential part of CSS. If I roll my cursor over this particular container on my page and click on it, we see the box model. Every element is either basically an inline or a block element. A box is just that, a block element on my page. For those of you who come from print, think of a box like a text box and maybe InDesign. InDesign is frame-based as well, so think of it kind of like that. So my box itself is made up of several different elements. I have a margin, a border, and padding, and my content area. So the width of the box is determined not by the margin, but by the border and the padding inside of my box. So you'll see by the actual CSS markup inside my box that I have an actual box, and inside of my curly braces are my properties and their values. So I have a margin of 20 pixels. The fact that I don't have margin top, margin right, margin bottom, and margin left, I've just used a little shorthand to not have to type all of those 4 different elements. And when we start typing CSS, you'll see what I mean. Same thing with my padding. I have a 10 pixel padding. I have a border of 5 pixels all the way around. My width is 400 and my height is 200. So when I take a look at my box model, my box is not actually 400 pixels. I need to do a little addition. So my padding on both sides, my left and my right, would be then 20 pixels. So I'm up to 420 pixels. If I add my border on each side, I have 5 on each side, so I'm up to 430 pixels in width. So I now no longer have a 400 pixel width box. Now, if I'm trying to put 2 boxes side by side inside of another container that is a fixed width, then I could totally be in trouble with the size and the width of my box. We need to keep this in mind as we work. So let's take a look. My margins are always transparent. My borders can be solid, dotted, inset, all sorts of things, although not all of those items display exactly the same on every browser. So when we take a look at those, we'll make sure and point out which of those actually look the same in all the browsers. My background settings for an element apply to the area just inside the borders, which includes both the padding and my content area, just like we mentioned earlier. So my width includes my borders and my padding inside of my content area. Now, a box can contain any number of other boxes. So I could have a box inside of a box inside of a box inside of a box. Now, just like we used to do with tables, we've seen some pretty hideous sites with tables inside of a table, inside of a table, inside of a table. So this is probably another part where we could say, just because you can doesn't mean you should put a box inside of a box inside of a box inside of a box. It may also seem initially strange, but margins can even be a negative value. My margins are an important part of a box. So for instance, I could have it centered in the middle of my page. I could make sure, like the one that's on there right now, it has a margin. And so it doesn't go all the way over to the very edge of my page. So I can use my margin for positioning as well. So another important part of that is that the browser window serves as the root element for the hierarchy. So that brings us to another topic of positioning, which we will get more in depth a little bit later on. So I've got different box types. So I've got 2 basic types. I've got block and inline. My block types are my p tags, my divs, or heaven forbid, a table. We use tables quite a bit still. Tables are great for data. Remember, they're just not for layout. We use divs for layout. My inline boxes are generated by tags, like my strong or my M. For those of you who have been in web design previously and maybe just getting back into using Dreamweaver CS5, then we don't typically use our B tags and our I tags any longer. So no B for bold, I for italic. We use strong for bold and M for italic. And no, it's a different measurement than an M. I know that can be a little bit confusing, but it's definitely a different measurement. And we can also use span and actual content like text or images. We'll get more into spans and things like that later as well. So we've got some basic positioning, 3 basic schemes, normal, float, and absolute. We refer to them as AP elements inside of Dreamweaver. Normal is the default though, so containers can fall under each other, not side by side. So if I have 2 containers, maybe they're not even exactly the same width, they're always going to be underneath one another. Now, inline boxes are wrapped as needed, and we'll talk more about that, and that can get ugly and overlapping really fast. Relative positioning is designated by position, colon, relative, semicolon, and we'll talk more about the actual structure of our CSS in a bit. This can be a bit tricky, and we'll explain more of that in depth later. But meanwhile, just kind of think of it as relative to what? Relative to the browser, relative to another container, etc. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Floats are something that always kind of trips people up. And we'll make sure that you understand floats. They're really not all that hard. So typically a float is either left or right. Think of it like an image inside of a box that has text in it, and you want that text to wrap around that image, not the image to sit all kind of by itself. You want the text to wrap around it. Or think of it as you want 2 boxes actually side by side. Now normally we said that the containers cannot be side by side. They're going to fall underneath one another. So being able to float that side by side is kind of essential, and there's several different ways to do that, obviously, and again we'll take a look at that in a little bit. But there's some basic rules before we get into floats and think about floats. So for instance, a float on a container needs to have a width assigned. Now, they're always also treated as block level containers. So they could accidentally overlap other containers if not treated properly, if not cleared properly. They will float over top of other items on the page. So when we have two or more items are floated and there's not enough space, then the other one will align to the bottom of the box beside it because you haven't necessarily done your math correctly. So we have to keep our box model in mind when we're floating those elements so that we aren't adding too much room or too many pixels side by side because all of that math has to add up. The structure of my HTML is also very important. So if I have two containers that I want to be side by side and only one of those is going to float, the other is going to use margin to push itself away from the float container, then that float container has to sit above my other non-floated element in my HTML. So let's start applying a little bit of what we've learned so far. In Chapter 6, there's a file called cssstyles.html. You should be able to see over in your Files panel. Go ahead and open that up. Now this particular page doesn't look very good. You might remember from an earlier chapter, we took a look at our page properties and what we could style on our page with those page properties. If I click on this page properties button at the bottom of my property inspector, I see that I already have some things applied. I have a page font, a size, a text color, a background color, my left and my right margins. I do have some link colors in here as well, and some heading sizes and colors also. I'm just going to click either, it doesn't matter, OK, cancel, whatever. And let's take a look at the code. So if I go to my code, you might remember that we talked about the fact that when we use the page properties, it ends up inside of your page itself. So per page. So imagine this is probably not something that you would want to do very often. This is something that is going to take precedence over an actual external style. So if I accidentally styled the same thing here, then had something as an external style, then it's going to be this particular styling, not what I have in my external style. So I really want to be careful also because it's on the page itself and not external, so that if I have a whole bunch of pages to update for that particular, whether it's a p tag or an h1 or an actual element on my page, we need to be aware of the inheritance value of what we have on our page. Now, I also said that our page properties isn't a bad place to start if you're learning CSS. What you need to be aware of it is we basically need to take it out of our page and make it external so that we can add to it from there. So this is how we do that. So if I take a look at the actual element itself, I saw the end tag there. And if I scroll up a little bit on my page, then I also see the beginning tag. So I have a style type equals text/CSS. So I see that I have my body defined here, and I'm going to highlight from there all the way down to the end curly brace. I don't want to include the closed tag in that as well. So once I have that selected, I can either do one of two things. I can either right click inside of where I have selected, or I can use my sidebar for my code and show more. So I've got my move or convert CSS. So if I click on that, I can say I can convert an inline CSS to a rule, which is really handy. So if somebody has accidentally put some inline styling, you can convert that to a rule. Or maybe some older code. Sometimes you run across some pages that have been around for a long time, and a lot of times people in the very beginning when they started using CSS had put things in line instead of actually putting them in rules, really simply because they didn't know any better. So if you ever run across something that's actually in line, that we can indeed move it from being in line to an actual rule. So I'm going to choose Move CSS Rules here, or again, if I was on the page itself, and let me highlight that one more time. I would right click, I would say CSS Styles, and Move CSS Rules. So I'm going to move this to a new style sheet, and I will click OK. Make sure that we're in our right chapter. So I see that I'm in my chapter 6 inside of my assets, inside of my CSS. And I'm going to just call this my style, and make sure you put the .css on it, because that way then Dreamweaver knows that it's a CSS file right away. That's really all I have to do when I'm typing even something. So if I right click on my site root and add a new file, as long as I put the extension on it, then Dreamweaver knows exactly what it's meant to be. So I'll say save. And now I see that I have a link there instead. So we're even going to get rid of that link. And I'm going to refresh my CSS Styles panel. Make sure you can see your CSS Styles panel, and it's clicked on All instead of Current. So I also have one little bit left in here as well, just so you know that you don't have to find it in the code. If I want to get rid of that little style bit, because I really don't need it now, if I want to get rid of that, I just click on it over in my Styles panel, and I click on my trash can to get rid of that. So now I have absolutely no styles defined. If we take a look at our design view, we see that we just have really just strictly a bunch of text on a page. I do have a heading 1 and a heading 3 here, etc. On my page, I've got some paragraphs, and I have some unordered lists on my page as well. So let's take a look at our CSS Styles panel. And at the very top, I mentioned make sure you click on All instead of Current. If I had something in here and chose Current, then I could see just what the current selection is, and we'll click on that when we have some styles back again. I have a window for all of my rules and then the properties that go along with those rules. On the left-hand side at the bottom, I have 3 different windows. I can show my category view, I can show a list view, and just the properties only for that particular set. We'll click on these again once we actually have something in our file. So on the right-hand side, I have several different buttons as well. I can attach a style sheet. I can create a new CSS rule. It's grayed out at the moment, but I can edit, disable, and trash something. So we need to actually attach our style sheet. So go ahead and click on Attached, and we get this great little dialog box that tells me what file or URL do I want, and I can also browse to it. Then I can add that as either a link or I can import it. Now the problem with importing is it throws it right back inside of my head tags where we just took the other one out of. And then once I have that, I've got several different types of media type. It's just good practice to go ahead and get yourself used to using these on a regular basis, because if I declare what my main CSS is, which would be my screen style, then when I choose handheld or braille or teletype or TV or projection or handheld or even print, then those will automatically be used for those particular devices or when I print, etc. So I'm going to choose screen, and I'm going to browse to my assets folder in my CSS and to my style and click OK. Now, while I'm in this dialog box, I also want to point out that every time I do this, I'm taking a look at my URL down here underneath this little horizontal line. So my URL, assets, CSS, my style, and it's relative to the document that I'm using at the time. Now we need to pay close attention to this, because whenever I create a new page, depending on where that page is at, if it's inside another folder, etc., my pathing may be a little different. So I'm just going to click OK. It is indeed screen, so I know what type it is, And now I'm going to click OK. So our page still isn't all that pretty yet, but if I twirl down my arrow, or on the PC here, my little plus, I see that I have all of those styles. So I see that I have a body style, and my cursor here, let me collapse my files panel so I can actually see my CSS styles. Now, depending how big your screen is and how you like to work, I could also tear this out of here, and I could put this in anywhere that I wanted. So maybe I might want this inside with my insert, and I just wait until I see that nice big thick blue line all the way around and it's inside of that particular panel. Or if I wanted it all on its own, then I could wait till I see the thick blue line just between those two panels, and I could drop that and have it be in its own particular panel. And I could also drop this on either side of the page that I wanted. So if I'm going to pull it all the way over to the left, I see that now I've got a little bit smaller area in the middle, but I have a panel on the left, and I also have my panels on the right. Once again, if I wanted this to be my new workspace, I would go up to Designer or to my window menu and say New Workspace. So this is my new workspace. Not a bad idea having my CSS styles all by themselves over on the left-hand side. Again, just depending on how much room that you have. And I hope you all have two nice huge monitors. I know that's not always the case, but I hope you all have nice big monitors. I don't have that much room, so I'm going to go ahead and pull mine back over, maybe next to my insert bar. So let's take a closer look at the elements on my page. I'll fold that back up so I can actually see this. So if I click on that very first button down here and show category, I can see all the categories that I could possibly choose for that particular element. So I could do font style or line height, and I've got all of them showing here. So background and border and block level elements, etc. If I click on that second button over and show just my list view, then I can see the properties for that, but I can also then see other things that I might want to choose as well. Now the third view is my favorite view, strictly because then I can see the actual properties for that particular element. Now I'm going to click on, say, my heading 1 here on my page, and if I click on current over in my CSS panel, I see a summary for that particular selection. So I see that I've got my font family, my font size, and a color. I'm going to pull this up just a little bit. And here we have two different buttons. So this shows me what's basically defined for that particular rule. And if I click on this button over the farthest side, that's my cascade. So basically what I'm talking about when I say cascade is what elements above it, so what parent elements have already been defined, so that I don't actually have to define anything for this particular element. So my body tag already has some things defined, which is my font style, for instance, has already been defined. And my rule for my H1 is right next to it, because really the only other parent element is my body tag at this point. If I click on another element here, so my P tag, for instance, again, I should be aware of what things that my body tag already has defined. So for instance, if I wanted my P tag or my paragraphs to be the same font as the body tag, then I don't need to redefine those again here. So here I've decided that I want my font to be a different size than my body. I've got a margin top and a margin bottom, whereas my body tag has said everything to be a margin of 0. As we get into more elements, we'll be able to see that cascade just a little bit better. So when your cursor sits anywhere on the page long enough, you get this icon that pops up. Now this icon is our code navigator. Now when I roll my cursor over it, I can click on it. When I click on it, I see my cascade, and then I can click on an element. And in this case, I can see that I have a margin top, a margin bottom, a font size, and a line height. And I can just Alt-click to show that, or Command-Option-click on the Mac to show that. And anytime that I would like, I don't have to wait for the icon to pop up. I can open that with those keyboard shortcuts anytime I would like. So Alt-click here on the PC to bring that open. Now, sometimes that icon can be a little distracting, so I can disable that, but then I would have to use my keyboard shortcut to bring that open. Now, there's one more place that we need to look at before we move on to our next lesson, and that is our actual property inspector. On my CSS button here, I can see that I have a targeted rule right now for my P. If I click on that, then I also see the capability of seeing the cascade, that really at this point, my only parent container is my body tag. I could create a new rule from here. I could create a new inline style. Heaven forbid I should create a new inline style, but there are times when it does come in handy. I can apply a class from here if there were any classes that I could apply to that particular element. I do have the container, although where my cursor is selected at the moment, I probably wouldn't want to apply my container to that. And I could apply or just remove a class from here. So next we'll take a look at more in depth into our panel and our property inspector, and we'll actually start applying those things to this particular page. So now that we've taken a little bit closer look into CSS, let's take that another step farther. So our tag selector at the bottom of our window, I've mentioned before, is really important. We're going to use that now as an example of what we can do with this. Again, this is a very simple example. We'll use it more as we progress in our lessons. But I'm going to click on my body tag selector. So it's going to select everything on my page. Let's go up to my insert menu. And I'm going to choose Layout Objects, and the very first thing on here is my div tag. So my div tag, we mentioned before, is a block level element, and that is what we're going to surround the content of our page with, is a div tag. So I'm going to choose div tag, and this handy little dialog box pops up. This particular method is especially helpful in Design View, because then I can visually see when I have elements that I would like to wrap on the page, or I could add a class or ID before or after those elements on my page. So for instance, I've got several different options here. When I insert, I can wrap around a selection after the start of a tag or before the end of a tag. So I can say where in my structure am I going to add this particular div. Now I don't have any other tags, or the second thing would pop up over here as well. So I'm going to wrap this around my selection. I have a class style and I don't have an ID style. And if you'll bear with me for just a minute, I will explain what each of those things are in depth. So I do have a container, and I'm going to click OK. And now we see that we have a box in the middle of our page that is centered. And now instead of a gray background for our text, we actually have a white background and a black border, if you can see that. If we click on Live View, you can actually see that there is indeed a black border surrounding our entire content of our page. So let's take a look at this. Maybe we'll change something about this. So click on All over in your CSS panel, and I see what structures or what elements that I have defined over here at the moment. So let's just click on Body, and at the bottom of my panel, I'm going to click on the little Edit rule. So I can either double click the word, or I can click on my Edit rule, my little pencil, to open up the dialog box that lets me see all of the options that I have. Now, again, I could always write this, but if I'm not that familiar with it, which I'm hoping that there's some of you that are brand new to CSS, ready to embrace it. So let's take a look. So I click on my little edit button here, and we're going to go through these categories. Some of them will apply to the element that we have. I just want to explain and have us understand all the categories, and I will explain what things could apply and what things may not apply. So I'm going to start with my type category. So here's where we've declared for our body tag that our default for anything that falls underneath or anything that is a child element of our body tag. So anything inside of our page really could be a child element, is then going to have a default font of Verdana. And if they don't have Verdana, then it's Helvetica. If they don't have Helvetica, then it's Arial, then Geneva, then I'll take any sans serif that they have on their machine. I've declared my font size to be 62.5%. We've mentioned that before. That's just one technique out of many in defining my font size. But this way, it basically then equals 10 pixels, which is a whole lot easier for me to define what size of fonts that I want, etc. And again, why we use our percentage here and then our M's for our measurements otherwise is really so that it fits the best within all of my browsers. If I used pixels, then older browsers wouldn't be able to up the size if a person decided to do Control plus or Command plus, depending on which platform they're on. So this is really a much better way of defining our sizes because it is scalable. So I have also a font style. I could choose normal, italic, or oblique for my font style. I have a line height that I could give an actual value to or just say normal. My font weight, I have normal, bold, bolder, lighter, and a whole bunch of numbers. Now the numbers are great if you are in the future at some point and we are all using OpenType fonts, which is designed by Adobe and Microsoft several years back. It is a true platform independent font, and the programs that can take advantage of it, it can have up to 65,000 characters. So our actual numbers here would really come into play if everybody already had OpenType fonts on their machine, which they don't. So 400 is about normal. I have a font variant. Do I want normal or small caps? Text transform. Now this is our body tag that we're talking about, but think of if when I have my H1 through H6 selected, then this is a great way for me not to have to worry about an actual font if I, not a font, but the actual style of it, if I want all of my subheads, for instance, to be uppercase instead of a combination. Or if I don't know who typed the text that I'm actually getting to place in the page, then I might say, oh, let's make sure and capitalize so that if they typed something in lowercase, then it will capitalize instead. I choose my color here. Now we have our 216 colors to choose from that were at one point considered our web-safe colors. At this point in time, in 2010 and CS5, honestly, I really don't care about our web-safe colors. Quite often, I'm picking up colors out of an image that's inside of my file, or I'm just going to my color picker and choosing a color from here, and I could add that to my custom colors, for instance, if that's what I wanted my body type to be. Let's take that back to black. Our text decoration is something that we wouldn't actually be talking about for our body tag, but it would for a link. So for instance, if I have a link on my page and I want somebody to be able to click on it, then I can decide whether it's going to be underlined by default, whether it's going to be overlined, a line through, or strike through, how I kind of prefer to think of that. Blank, don't use it. Just kidding. Most of your browsers don't understand what blink is any longer. It's a very old tag. It's been around for a long time, and we don't typically use them. Or none, which means I wouldn't have an underline on my link at all. So our background category. I can choose my background color. If I have a background image, I can put that in my file as well. So I would just browse to it. I get to choose whether it's going to repeat, not repeat, repeat X, or repeat Y. So X is from the left-hand side over, and Y is from the top of my page down. Whether I'm going to have a background attachment or not, fixed or scroll, we'll explain more about that later. And my background position, so is it going to be left, center, or right, and my Y, top, center, or bottom. So at this point, I kind of want you to think about the possibilities of things inside of containers, whether they want to be at the top or I have them fixed to the bottom. There's lots of possibilities there. My block category, I have word spacing, letter spacing, vertical align, text indent, white space, and display. Now my word spacing, letter spacing, and white space are not exactly the same in every single browser, so I don't typically use them all that often. There is a time and place to use everything, but basically I'm not going to typically use those. I do have a text align, so think about my container. Do I want my text to be left aligned, right aligned, or centered? And I can also use justified. And for my display, I either have a display of none, so if I don't want anything to show in that particular container at all, I can say none, and it won't display anything, even text. Inline, we'll do an example of inline styling when we talk about navigations. Block level, a block display, again, this is really handy for doing navigations and other types of things where I want a container around my particular element. For our body style, not necessarily. List item, run in, etc. We're not going to discuss every single one of these. We'll discuss the ones that we use the most inside of CSS, and the rest you'll have to explore on your own. My box category is where you'll end up spending the majority of your time. So with a particular box, I can say the width and the height of that particular box, whether it's going to float or not, whether it needs to be cleared or not. I have my padding and my margins. Notice that I have my top margin here and pixels all the way around. It's same for all. So I have 0 margin around the whole entire page. I don't have any padding inside of my body. My body tag is probably not the best place to add padding. I would want that in an actual container. My border category, I have none, dotted, dashed, solid, double, groove, ridge, inset, and outset. Really, where it starts at double, groove, etc. None of those look exactly the same in every browser at this point. So they're typically not ones that I usually use because I like things to look pretty much the same in the majority of the browsers. So I pretty much stick to solid, dashed, and dotted, even though nothing but solid looks exactly the same in all browsers. I can choose a width, whether that's going to be thin, medium, thick, or an actual value, and I can choose, again, a color, whether it's on my page. You can see as I move my cursor around, I'm picking up the different colors on my pages. There we go. I'll make sure I click that none. I don't want to have just one thing and not the other. To get your border to work properly, you need to make sure you have all 3 of these things defined. You don't want just one of these things in here. I have a list category. So for instance, if I had my bulleted list there that you can see on the page, I could say that my list type might be none, or I want just a disk or a circle, or I can choose something else. Of course, this is an unordered list, so if I chose Roman numeral, then that would need to be an ordered list, be able to see the Roman numeral or upper alpha, etc. I can choose to have or display an image instead of my bulleted item. So for instance, if I had a site that was very nature oriented and I wanted there to be a little leaf instead of a bullet, then I can design that little leaf in whatever image editing program that I choose, and then browse to that particular image here, and then that would show up instead of my bullet. It's very cool. It's very handy to use. And then I have my list positioned. So is that bullet going to be on the inside or the outside? Because basically my list is like a block level element. So it thinks about whether it's going to be on the inside of the padding or the outside of my padding, and margin from there. My positioning. Now this really gets a little bit more complicated. So this is where I would also choose whether I needed something to be absolute, fixed, relative, or static. And again, we'll get more into that later. If I choose something to be absolute, for instance, then I could choose to have that visibility either be inherent, which is the default anyway, so just it's always visible, or actually hidden. Those AP elements have a z-index as well. So the stacking order that they are in the page. So those absolutely positioned items can stack on top of one another. And those items can also then have an overflow, whether it's going to be visible or hidden, scroll, or auto. So if I've given a container an actual height and an overflow of auto, and there's more content than the actual height I've given the container, then the scroll bars will actually show up, and the end user would have to scroll for that particular item. That can be quite nasty, by the way. I've got placement. Where is it going to be positioned on my page? If we're talking about an absolutely positioned item, it is absolutely positioned on my page relative to that 00 mark in the upper left-hand corner of my browser window. So if I wanted this particular container to sit 50 pixels down on my page and 50 pixels over, then I would say top 50 and left of 50, and that would be my absolutely positioned placement of that item. And I can also do some clipping of that as well. In my extensions, I can do a page break before and a page break after. Basically, when I do a print style, where is that page going to actually break? Because I want it to print properly. And I can do some cursor effects. Again, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I have some filters that only show up in IE. So if you're doing an intranet site and you know that the whole entire company's browser is IE6, for instance, and again, I feel sorry for you if it is, but it's very possible still at this point, then you're able to use all of these filters when they're not going to really show up in any other type of modern browser. So we'll just say okay to what we have here. And now we can go on to our next lesson. So now we can take a better look at the actual selectors themselves. So our styles can be inherited from a parent element. Our body tag is a great example of this. So we define our font in our body tag, and then all of our child elements automatically inherit that. So in a style sheet, if you define that same element twice, the later style is then used, not the very first one. For instance, if I do the same thing for H1, so I call the color for H1 blue up above, I forget that I've styled H1 and I style that same H1 later on down in my style sheet, and I call it red the second time around, then my style is red. It's not blue. So we need to keep inheritance in mind. So our styles can come from multiple places. So it's inherited from the parent container. You can also do inline styles, embedded styles, and our external style sheets, which is always the best policy whenever possible to use an external style sheet. That way I can style that 1,000-page website and just have a few style sheets that I can use instead of styling them inline and then having to find those where it's styled inside of those pages. So we can use any combination of elements, ID, class names, and modifiers. So HTML elements, tag-based, our body tag, H1, tables, block quote, etc. We've got modifier pseudo classes, a link, a visited, a hover, and a active in those orders. And our IDs can only be used once per page. They need to be unique in name, and designated with a pound sign. So for instance, if I had a footer on my page, then I wouldn't want two footers, typically. And if I thought that I might for some reason, then I would want to make sure that that's a class style, which is my next type of style. And it's designated with a period in front of it. And I can have as many of those as I want on my page, but they have to be actually applied. So for instance, if you are from the print world and are just now getting into CSS, you might think about your IDs as your paragraph styles and your class styles more like a character style, where I would physically have to maybe highlight something and apply that particular style to that element. Of course, you can apply a class style to absolutely anything. You could have your whole entire page class styles. And depending on who you talk to these days, some people don't like using IDs. Some people only like class styles. Some people like laying out the page in IDs and then using my class styles for other elements inside a container. But that's something we can talk more about later. So some of my other selector types are my universal selectors. So a universal selector is designated with a asterisk in front of it. And that would be something like if I want to zero out all of my margin and all of my padding on my page, really all of my elements. Now we haven't written any CSS yet, but by default, some of my elements like my text have a default margin to them. And even if I designate my body tag as having 0 margin and 0 padding, then my text still has its own little bit of default margin to it. We have something called collapsing margin. And so, for instance, whatever my selector types, whatever default spacing is between my different text elements. So for instance, I would probably have a little more spacing with my H3 that I have here. So I have an H3 on my page, and then I have after it a P tag. So for instance, and I'm not saying that it does or it doesn't have a particular bit of spacing. So let's say that my H1 up here has a 15 pixel margin above it and a 15 pixel margin below it. But my P tag down here underneath it has a margin top or margin above that element to be 10 pixels and 10 pixels below it. So to explain my collapsing margins, unlike print where those two measurements would combine and then I would have that much extra space in between my two elements, in CSS, those things collapse and whatever is the largest number holds true. So if it's 15 pixels underneath that H1, then I would have 15 pixels between it and the P tag below it. It wouldn't be a combination of the two. But between my P elements, because they're the same type element, that they would have the exact same then above and below it. We'll write our own later, so if I have thoroughly confused you, we'll see it in action. My compound selector is next. We've talked about this just a little bit. So if I had all of my H elements that I wanted to be a particular color, then instead of doing those as separate selectors, I could string them all together with a comma and make sure that they all had the exact same color. That way I don't have to have that many extra lines of code. I can designate them all in the same bit of code. We've talked about ID selectors, and they have a pound in front of them. And then we have our class styles that have a dot in front of them. So as in dot blue. And we also have our type selectors, so our H1, our Ps, etc. And they match all type elements in our document tree. Now we have some other types of selectors in here that gets a little bit more geeky, if you will, a little bit more complicated. I don't want to totally confuse you first thing out of the gate on CSS. So let's take a look at our page itself here and our elements in our styles and what else that we might actually want to style on our page. So we don't have any links on our page, and so we can go ahead and style those. Now we do have a link, a visited, a hover, and a active. Now we can always combine those again until we actually start writing some CSS. I don't want to confuse anyone. So let's make our own style. So let's say this very top part of our page, we want to be our header. Now we're going to write this code later on in another chapter, but for now we're going to stay in just the design view. So I'm going to highlight around this little bit of text here. Now I see by the way that my page is highlighted that I have my live view on. So if you've been following along and you happen to have clicked on live view up above, make sure that is not selected because I won't be able to do anything with this bit of text that I have highlighted in this particular view. So I'm going to go ahead and click live view so I can see the actual elements on my page. Now I'm going to go up under my insert menu, layout objects, and div tag. So again, I could wrap around after start, before, end of tag. We're going to wrap this around our selection. Now I've just talked about how my class styles need to have a dot in front of it and my IDs need to have a pound sign in front of it. When I use this particular technique in this particular dialog box, so if I go to my insert menu and use my insert div tag, then I don't want to actually put any name or like a dot or a pound sign when I use these because CS5 is smart enough to know what I want it to do. If I put something in my ID, it will go ahead and put it inside of my CSS code as a pound sign first. If I use my class style, then it will go ahead and put a dot in front of it first as well. So I'm just going to do an ID of header. I could also click on new CSS rule and it goes ahead and puts that header in there for me. So if I didn't have one before, then I would have just put something around it with called it header. Since I said new CSS rule, it goes ahead and opens this particular dialog box. So these are the choices that we normally have. We have this great little drop down menu. I have class, ID, tag, and compound. So all the ones that we would normally use on a regular basis are right here. And the nice thing is even if you don't remember what each of those things are, this will be very clear and tell you class can be applied to any HTML element, ID applies to only one HTML element, tag redefines an HTML element. And by the way, just as a best practice, if you define your tags, they will automatically be defined inside of your page. So that means that you can grab that text from anywhere, and as long as it is a paragraph, a H1 through H6, an unordered list, ordered list, definition list, etc., it will go ahead and apply whatever you have applied here in your CSS to that portion of the page without you having to highlight it and tell it to be a particular item. Also, you need to think about your structure as well when you're thinking about your tags and your IDs and your classes, because as we have mentioned, that your SEO and accessibility are also dependent upon how your page is structured as well. So you want to structure things as nicely as possible. So for instance, I want to start with an H1 as high as possible because that's what the search engines are going to give more importance to that portion of my page. H2 through H6, etc., lesser importance. So again, this was a ID that we had in here. Oops, I got rid of it. So I'm going to have to retype it. In there. We get to choose our rule definition where it's going to actually be defined. So we have our style sheet already. We don't want to accidentally have this applied to this document only. Now, there is also no reason to apply it to a new style sheet since we already have a style sheet here. So CS5 is great enough to tell you that this selector name will apply your rule to any HTML element with the ID of header. So I'll click OK. So let's make this a little unique so that we can actually see where it's at on the page. So I'm going to go to my background category and actually give it a background color. So I'll make it just so that we can see our styles on our page. I'll make it yellow. I don't have to worry about a background image and anything else that happens here because, again, I don't have a background image. I am going to go ahead and go to my box category. Now, we don't need to designate a width on something unless we want a specific width. So by default, it is going to take up 100% of the space given. Since our container has an actual width to it, then our header is only going to be as wide as that parent container. I am going to give it some padding though, so we can actually see that. So I'll give it, we'll make it really obvious and make it 20, same for all. Now we can use pixels or ems. Remember, pixels are not a relative measurement, but ems are. So we might want, let's just give this a little more, and let's say 5 ems. If I click on apply, we haven't actually applied it to that particular container yet, so you're not going to see anything. Go ahead and click OK. And now OK here, and that will actually apply that to our page. So we have this huge amount of spacing, which is our 5em. And it is indeed yellow. It is indeed unattractive. And in your CSS panel, just so that you can see how this changes, because we already have this applied to our page, if I take this down to 1em and just hit my enter or return key, then we see it update on our page automatically. And I see I have a much better spacing for those items on my page. So let's take a look at our H1 up here, and we see that our H1 has a color of red, and it already has a font size, but we can add either some other properties or we can change this up just a little bit. So for instance, if I edit my rule here, and I'm going to leave the font size the same, I'm going to leave the color the same, but let's go take a look at our collapsing margins. So for instance, I'm going to uncheck same for all, and I'm going to give this a margin of 0 up top and a margin of 0 at the bottom. Now you'll see that it won't actually collapse with the element underneath it because that is a different tag. So it already has its own default margin top and bottom of it as well. But I can do something interesting with the padding of this. So if I wanted to give this some extra room in, we'll make it again obvious. And I'll just say 20 pixels, and I'm going to click OK. I see that I now have my element up to the top of my page. Now the padding on the container itself, or header, is keeping this from going all the way up to the very top. But because we gave it some padding, it's moved in from the left-hand side, and I don't have anything collapsing here because that's how much spacing this particular element underneath it is given. So that's just an intro look into the different types of selectors. One of my personal favorite things about CSS is being able to take something and restyle it at any given moment. Back when I used to style things with tables, the problem with tables was that we used to put images inside of the cells, not anything as a background image, because the cells didn't always stay as tall as they wanted or as wide as you wanted, and putting a background image in them didn't always work out to be as great as you had hoped. So now that we have CSS pages and all of our structure is CSS, I can style my page with a little bit more confidence that in 6 months when the client changes their mind, or even if it's my site and I change my mind 6 months from now, I can restyle my page in very little time. So we use something we call background images a lot. So the background image basically is designated in the CSS. I declare it there, And it is just then basically an image on the server that in the HTML I'm saying display this image here. It's not physically sitting on my page, it's just being displayed from the server onto my page. And this is how we can put it together. So if you open join.html, and because of my resolution, I'm going to put my page just a tiny bit smaller by Command or Control minus. I know it doesn't look as nice this way, but at least I can see more of my page this way. If I put my cursor in where it says join, you'll notice that it's a heading 1. Now, heading 1 is exactly what I would want on that page for SEO reasons and accessibility reasons. This is going to help in my search engine, help with the structure of my page, because I want items of more importance towards the top of my page. But it doesn't look very pretty just sitting there by itself. Join, meetings, photo walks, contact, etc. So I want this to be a little bit more unique. I also take a look at my CSS styles, and I notice that I've got a compound selector for all of my, here let me collapse my files view so I can actually see this a little bit better. So for all of my elements, my H1, I took my H2 out of there at one point because I had it styled totally differently. I didn't want it to have the exact same padding and margins as everything else did. H3, H5, H6, and my P has a margin left of 15 pixels and a margin right of 15 pixels. That way, I really don't have to give the containers themselves actual padding. The elements themselves have the padding on them. So I can just put them in the page, and I don't have to worry about the actual structure itself. The elements have the effect that I want on them. So I see that I have something for an H2 in here. And if I were to take this and turn it into an H2, I see that I already have a style applied to that. So I have it as a lighter gray. It has some line height and some margin and some padding to it. And I also have a border bottom of a dotted line or a dashed line. I see dashed, okay? So that's already styled. But I don't want that at the very top of my page because it is more important than anything else is. So I really want that to be an H1. So I'll take it back to H1 and I will add my own CSS rule, which we have not really done so far over in our panel yet. So once again, the links over on the right hand side, the very first one is attach a style sheet. So if I didn't have a style sheet applied, I would click that little button and I would attach the style sheet from here. My second button over is my new CSS rule, which is what we're going to do right now. And I have an edit rule. In my other current style, I can disable a style as well, which we can't do at the moment because we're not in that particular part of the panel. Before I actually make my style, I want to make sure that I'm really in the right place. So I really try and keep things in order as they are on the page. So in my CSS file itself, I would have all of my major elements, my global elements at the top of my page. Then my structure, then any content elements, then any maybe class styles at the bottom, making sure that I don't repeat anything as well. I keep everything commented out nicely also. That way that if somebody else looks at my file, they're able to make heads and tails out of it easily. So I'm going to click up here, and then I'm going to click on my new CSS rule button. It automatically understands that I'm inside of something, so it shows me my compound based on the selection where my cursor is at. So it sees that I have an outside container called container. Then I have a content wrapper where my cursor happens to be at the time. Then I have a container called column 2 stretch, and then my H1 element. Just so I don't confuse anything, whenever I'm working with my CSS, as often as I possibly can, I try and keep any of my main level elements like this, my H1s, etc., as true to their form as they can be, so that if I put an H1 absolutely anywhere on my page, then it looks like an H1 anywhere else on my page. So I will click OK. Maybe we'll give this another color. Let's make it white. I'm going to go to my background category first though, because I want to see the actual background image that I'm going to place in here and see if I need to change any spacing, margins, padding, etc. So I'm going to go to my background image and I'm going to click Browse. Making sure that I'm in Chapter 6. I'm going to go to my Assets and my Images. And I can see a little bar here. So I have this image called H1BG for H1 background. And it's just this interesting little bar that I made in Fireworks. So I will click OK, taking note of the size also, so that it's 672 pixels wide and it's 35 pixels tall. It is a PNG. So if it did have transparency to it, I would need to be aware of that in older browsers like IE6 that wouldn't be able to see that PNG file as being transparent. It's going to put a background color to it, so I need to be aware of these things and make sure that I understand who my client is and who they expect to be visiting their website. So I will click OK. This is not going to repeat. I am going to give this an X of left and a background position of center. Now the reason I'm doing that is because I would really like it to be in the center of my H1 element. So I'm going to click Apply. And now I have this really nice, oh, I've got a repeat. No repeat. There we go. I click Apply again, and now I see that it does not repeat. Now the element itself is all the way over to the edge. Do I want that or don't I want that? It's really up to me. So just so that we can see what it looks like, if I go to my box category, my padding is going to go for the element itself, and my margin, if I say, let's say margin left of 15, and I click Apply, I see it took the element, the background image, and gave it a margin left of 15. So now it sits even with the rest of my text on my page. I click OK. And I will zoom my page back up again by Control plus or Command plus so I can actually see this a little bit better. And I'll go ahead and click on Live View this time so I can actually see what that would look like in my page. Now I do have my footer in this particular file as being fixed for my position. So it's always going to be on top of the other elements on my page. So that's why you see the footer actually sitting above everything else. And if I would want to scroll, then it scrolls underneath that particular footer. So that's one example of a background image. If we take a look at the body tag itself here, we see that it also has a background image. So for instance, if I want to see what this actually looks like, I'll go over to my current and I see where my background image is here. If I click on where it says my URL at up here, notice that for once at the very bottom of that panel, I have my little no symbol actually enabled now. It's not grayed out any longer. And this allows me, while I'm just looking at my CSS, to click that and say apply or don't apply to that particular element. And I'll show that again. Of course, I had my cursor sitting in that particular portion of my file. Now I can see the actual element itself up here. I can see my body. And now I can actually see the cascade underneath it here. So where I happen to be selected at the time, it's marking out my background image, and if I roll over this, it says background does not apply to your selection because it's not inherited it is applied to the enclosing tag. However, page elements are transparent by default, so this color may show through. So it's marking out the fact that I had a margin and a padding in there. I didn't really need that. It's taking on the body font, etc. Let's go back to all. And if I am selected on my body tag here, in my page, I'm going to cut out live view for a second here so I can actually click on my body tag. Live code is great, but that's one thing you have to be aware of, is that while you're in live code, there's certain things that you can and can't do on your page. So now if I say current and I click on this, I can also use a keyboard shortcut for turning this on and off. And on the PC, it is Control and Alt, and on the Mac, it is Command and Alt. And this will turn particular elements on and off. So I can enable that or disable that particular feature, so I can see, really this is a great debugging feature for CSS. Normally, I would have to take this in a browser like Firefox and use a plugin like Firebug to be able to turn on and off particular elements so that I can see where maybe I have some extra spacing that I really don't need in my file. This is strictly a CS5 feature as well. Being able to see the cascade to this degree is fantastic. So now we see what actual background images are and how they can improve our page. If you'd like to know more about background images or like better examples of background images, CSS Zen is a fantastic place to be able to explore the possibilities of CSS. So let's take what we've learned so far and actually put together and lay out an actual page in CSS. Let's have you open Layout and Layout End so you can see what we're going to accomplish. So let's take a look at this in our browser. I'm going to preview this in Firefox. And I see I have a structured page. So I have a header, I have a main content, I have a sidebar, I have a picture in the middle with the text that wraps around it, and I have a footer area at the very bottom. So let's make this happen. So if we take a look at our layout.html, I see that I have all those same elements as I scroll down my page, but nothing is structured at all. For this particular lesson, we're going to go ahead and do this in the designed view. At a later chapter, we'll actually look at doing this in the code view so that you know how to do both. I'm going to go ahead and click on Body and go up underneath my Insert menu, Layout Objects, and Div Tag. We've talked about this particular dialog box before. I can wrap it around the section, insert it before a tag, after a tag, etc. We're going to create our own ID here, and we're just going to call it wrapper. So now I have a container that I see by a dotted line selected around my page, and if I click on it, I see that I have a 0 margin, 0 border, 0 padding, because I haven't actually applied this to anything yet. I have this image up top for my header. I'm going to go ahead and select it, click beside of it, and I see that in my tag selector that there's an H1 involved in here as well. If I select that, that's actually wrapped around my image. I don't have any plans for that particularly right now, but there are a number of things that we could use for that particular tag with that image being inside of it. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it. Insert, Layout Objects, Div Tag, and we're using IDs here. Again, it doesn't really matter whether I use a class style or an ID. So I'm going to call this header. And I'll click OK. And now I have a container around that particular section. Where my main content is here, all the way down before it says sidebar 1, I'm going to do the same thing with it. Layout Objects, Div Tag, and that is going to be our main content. Noticing as I scroll here that the image that I have in here, the text doesn't wrap around it. So I'm going to have to create something for that text to wrap around that. If I look in my property inspector, I see that I do have a name to my image. I have a border of 0, just in case I decide to put a link on it. And I have alignment of default. Notice if I click on top, the top line of my text goes just to the top of it. If I click on middle, it goes just to the middle. And bottom, it goes just to the bottom. Now, if I were to use left or right align, it's going to wrap around that object, in our case, our image. The problem with this is that we don't actually have a style applied to this. So I'm going to take that back to default. We'll scroll down a little further, and I see where my sidebar is at, and I will highlight that down here to my footer area. One more time, insert, layout objects, div tag. This is going to be sidebar 1. Now we're going to use a float for this particular element, but it can be either left or right. So I don't have to worry about whether I have that in the name or not. It's going to go ahead and I can say at any point in time whether it's one way or the other. And one final one for my footer. Now we're not going to do absolutely every single bit of the work, but I do have a style sheet that we can use for this. So I'm going to click on my link, attach style sheet. I'm going to browse, and I'm going to choose layout new. It is going to link and not import, and my media type is going to be screen. And I will click OK. So if I take a look at my file, I see that I already have some elements in here. Let me fold up my files panel. And I see that I already have my body tag. I have a paragraph tag. And I have some of my main elements in here that don't have any properties to them whatsoever. So either double click where it says wrapper, or I can click on the edit rule. So we're going to go ahead and make this a little smaller just because my resolution is fairly small on my page, and I'm just going to make it 760 pixels. So for instance, if I were targeting an 800 by 600 browser, then I would probably choose 760 as my width so that I can take all of the elements of the browser into consideration. I would also like this to be centered in the middle of my page. So I'm going to choose auto for left and for right. So it's going to auto on one side, auto on the other, and now it will be centered inside of my page. If I were to click apply, I should be able to see this at this point, and I can. So we'll give this a little bit of a border, and we'll just do same for all. I'm going to use solid, and I'm just going to type 1 pixel, and I'll just use a nice light gray. Feel free to use any color that you'd like. And I'm going to click OK. So what we've learned so far is now that I've said it is 760 and I've put a border on it, my container is no longer 760. It's now 762. So if I really wanted to make sure that it was 760, I would go ahead and take that value out of my 760 and type 758. And now it's back to being 760. There's really nothing all that exciting going on with my header at the moment. I'm going to leave that for now so that we can come back to that later if we need it. My main content, however, we are going to style. I want my main content to be on my left and my sidebar to be on my right. because my main content comes before my sidebar in my structure of the page, we're going to go ahead and give this a float. So I'm going to click on my edit rule, and we're going to go to our box category. If this is going to have a float to it, I need to give an actual value to this. So I'm going to give a 500 pixel width, and I'm going to float left. I want to give this a little bit of margin left, so I will say 10 pixels. Now, I could also give this a padding as well, but we'll save that and see if we need it in just a little bit. So I will click OK. And I can see that my sidebar is now trying to move over to the right of it. We've mentioned before that with floats, every other element underneath it, unless I clear that float, is going to try and move to the side of that particular element. So now I'll choose my sidebar 1. I will edit my rule, move my page so I can actually see it. Let's go ahead and give it a little bit of a background color, and I'll make it that lighter gray color. Now my elements go all the way to the edge here, so let's take a look at our box, and I'm going to go ahead and give this a 10 pixel padding as well. This is going to float. Now I can either float it left like my other container, or I can decide to float it right. I'm going to go ahead and float this right. Now this also needs to have a pixel width to it. So for instance, if I thought I might want a 200 pixel width, I take a look and I've got a padding already. So let me take that out of my width, and I choose 180, and let's click apply. And I see that I have plenty of room here. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a little bit of margin on the right hand side because I don't want it pushed right up against the edge of my container. So I will say right of 10 and apply. So I like that just fine. I will click OK. Now notice that my footer area is trying to sneak in between those other two because it doesn't have a clear to it at all. So if I scroll down, I can really see the mess that it's creating at the moment. That I have my main content area. It looks like it's escaping out of even my wrapper, strictly because I have a float on the inside, so it can go over top and expand around other things unless I clear that float. So let's do our footer first, and then we'll clear it. So I've got my footer. I will click on my edit or double click it in my CSS panel. Now we've also mentioned that my child elements inside of my parent element will take on the characteristics that we put on the parent. So for instance, if I wanted all of my text in my footer to be white, I'll move this out of the way just so I can see it. And if I were to click apply, I don't see my text any longer. So now let's go over to my block category, and I would also like that to be centered inside of my footer, which is going to look really weird at the moment. So I'm going to go click on center. And let's say that we give that a little bit of a background color, and I'll make it nice and dark since our text is white. And back to box, and I'll give it just a little bit of padding on the inside. I don't want my text to sit right up against the rest of my elements. So I will click OK. And now I can really see what my float is trying to do. So it looks like my footer goes all the way up to the top of my content, but it really doesn't. If I take a look at my code with that highlighted, I'm going to make sure and click on footer here. I will click on code, and I see that it's really at the bottom of my code. So I'm going to click before the end of my div, and we're going to put our class style for clear float on a line break. And a line break is designated with a BR. So I've typed the first part of my tag. When I hit my space bar, my code hits pop up and let me see exactly what I can use for this particular area. we're going to use a class style, and we already have one designated as clear float, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. And all I need to do is hit my enter or return key after I choose something. Go ahead and put my cursor on the outside of my quote marks. So now I'm going to hit my /, and I will end that particular tag. I will refresh here, and when I go back to my design view and scroll down to the bottom of my page, you'll see that my footer is actually where I intend it to be. So what have I put on my clear float? I've just added a clear of both, and I've just given it a font size of 1 pixel so it doesn't really take up much space. Certainly not as much space as a regular line break would take. So now we're on to our image. So the image is the only thing we don't actually have declared over in our rules. We don't have a rule for that particular element. So I'm going to click on my new CSS rule. This is going to be a class style. I'm going to name it image float left. I will click OK. So simply, I'm going to float it to the left. Now we know already from looking at our other containers that if I float something, then everything beside it is going to try and wrap around it, which is exactly what we want with this image. And I will now choose my margin of 10 pixels on the right just so that the text doesn't flush with my image. I want a little bit of white space around it. Now I'll click OK. This already had the class applied to it, so when we made the class, it immediately wrapped the text around the side of it. Take a look at my property inspector, and you can see that I have a class style over here of image float left, and that was already assigned. But if this needed to be on the other side, then all I would need to do is make an image float right, apply that, and then my image would be over on the right-hand side of my page instead of the left-hand side of my page. That's the beauty of a class style. They can be applied at any point in time. I hope you've enjoyed working with page layouts, and feel free to further explore on your own.